Welcome to the latest episode of Gryphon Manor. Now, in the last episode, I embarked on my own little voyage of discovery, which expanded the known world by 300% and enabled me to bring back literally tons of goodies. And now the ad hoc space under the cottage and windmill is starting to look like something out of an episode of Hoarders, or maybe a crowded secret government warehouse. In fact, I could have sworn that I stumbled across the Ark of the Covenant the day before yesterday. Anyway, for those of you that are new to this project, or as a reminder for those of you that may have forgotten among the hustle and bustle of daily life, I'm using the Storage Drawers mod to facilitate my storage needs in this world. And if you're unfamiliar with this mod, may I humbly suggest that you check out my mod deep dive video for it. You can find a link to that video in the episode notes. So let me lay out the goals for this episode. When I built out the massive space for the main workshop, I already had the general design for my storage systems in mind. And in this episode, I will implement that design. So all my goals for this episode are directly related to that. I will install the storage infrastructure throughout the base. And yes, I do mean throughout the base. I'll go into greater detail on this in a few minutes, but to make all of this stuff work as intended, and thus save myself a lot of future time and effort, and a lot of wear and tear on my elevator, lift, or whatever the hell we want to call it at the moment, I will actually implement several related but separate storage networks that will work like old-fashioned pneumatic tube systems, and that will allow me to transfer items to the right place in the right network. Because when it comes right down to it, and all the video evidence to the contrary, I'm actually pretty lazy. The workshop levels that I excavated a couple of episodes ago is where the bulk of my materials and resources will live. And keeping it all in a central place is efficient. And if that centralized place is the same place where I will actually be using that material as part of some manual or automated process, then that's even more efficient. And that appeals to the lazy inner self I just admitted to. While most of my building and crafting resources will live in the main storage network, most, if not all of the stuff that one may potentially eat or use as an ingredient to make something to eat will live up near the surface where I will build out the kitchen for the manor proper. And just as a reminder, since it has been a while, the little cottage on the surface is not the manor. In fact, it's not even a the manor does not, technically, exist yet. And when the time comes, the cottage will go bye-bye and work will start on a much larger and grander surface structure. But until then, the cottage with the suspiciously large yard remains as a curiosity for the locals and any other passerby to gossip about. Anyway, the kitchen is a long ways from the main storage network, and I really don't want to be shuttling back and forth when I want to cook something. Even though I do have a slick and hyper cool elevator to help with that, this means that these items need to be kept much closer to the kitchen. And so that will be another storage network unto itself. Of course, that gives me two different sets of storage at opposite vertical ends of the base. And part of my design is that I can drop off materials for either storage network from pretty much any level of the manor, and the material should reach its intended place. Therefore, I will also install two vertical networks. One will be designed to bring resources down to the main storage and workshop level, and the other will be designed to carry foods and ingredients up to the kitchen level. Finally, since I need to define and set up the physical kitchen space as part of setting up the storage for edibles, I might as well set up the stuff in the kitchen itself. Now, technically it is part of the manor proper, but since the kitchen will be completely underground and the manor is supposed to be the big showy bit that's visible above ground, I will still continue to insist that the manor does not exist yet. However, all of this work will set me up for the next big step where I supply power to the base. And at that point, I will have everything I need to set up materials and resource farming, processing, and assembly. And then I can finally start working on shaping this world wholesale. Now, I have big plans, and I'll need all of this to make those plans even possible. Now, this is a side view of the current plan of the manor. The workshop and main storage are way the hell down here on these two monstrously large levels. while the edible stuff will be all the way up towards the surface, which also puts it close to the source of production, including the automated farms and livestock spaces. The ultimate goal is to have convenient drop-off locations located throughout the base, especially around the central lift. Now, these drop-off locations will use one of two separate networks. One network will have dark oak cabinets, and items placed into those cabinets will get carried down and deposited into the main storage network, while the other network will have cherry wood cabinets and will carry ingredients upwards and deposit them into the food storage network. Now, it's necessary to have multiple networks because of the nature of the storage drawers mod. Basically, each network can, by default, reach out up to 50 blocks away from the main controller through the use of secondary controllers. Now, that works out to be a sphere with a radius of roughly 50 blocks. And this can be extended to 75 blocks through the config file, and that's exactly what I've done here. While I could place a single network that would reach all the way to the top and all the way to the bottom of the base, it could not quite reach all the machines or the power generation stations in the workshop level. And to do that, I would need the main controller at or very close to those levels to allow the longer reach, which is what I planned for. But then those networks would have a tricky time of networking together, so that's why I added the two dedicated transport networks in the middle. Plus, keeping the network separate and overlapping gives me some flexibility in the design should I need to move things around a bit or, God forbid, if I decide to add more storage networks. So that's why I have incorporated this design that uses multiple networks like it does. The network will be comprised of 4 types of blocks: primary and secondary controllers, drawers, and trim blocks. Now, you can think of the controllers as relay stations that also serve to facilitate access into or out of the network. The drawers do the actual storage work, and while the drawers can also facilitate connectivity in the network, most of the actual network is hidden out of sight, where I'll use a whole lot of trim blocks because they carry items through the network, but they don't actually store anything, and therefore it's not necessary to have direct access to them. For those of you who are familiar with the Storage Drawers mod, you may have noticed that my drawers look a bit different, and that is of course by design. Now, as mentioned earlier in this series, and probably somewhere within the Gryphon Hall series, I use the Lithos 32X resource pack, but it doesn't cover everything, especially mods. So I've been spending some time and calories on the side to craft 32X textures for the stuff I am using, and while I'm at it, if I can add richer texture detail and make it more 19th century and steampunkish, then I might as well. And that's what I've done here to the drawers. For the purposes of full disclosure, the original textures are 16x, and I use Lithos, which is 32x. Now, when I created new textures for these drawers, I started with 32x, but the Victorian curlicues looked really bad. So I kept the 32x background texture, but rendered the rest of the texture as 64x, which gave me finer resolution on the curlicues so that they actually look pretty decent. Now, I may regret that later on, but for now, that is what I'm using, and now you know my terrible little secret. But I like it. In fact, I like it so much that as time allows, I'll go ahead and convert all the storage drawers textures to something like this. But I seem to have strayed a little bit off topic. Now, how exactly will I keep these trim blocks and controllers out of sight? Well, way back in the first or second episode of my Gryphon Hall series, I explained how I structure my levels. And for these underground levels, I have a designated conduit layer of blocks between each level, exactly for this kind of thing. So now that I've outlined the goals and the design, now it's time to just get it done. The central access shaft is not just the main artery for people. Well, me. I'm a people too, even if there is only one of me, plurals in English notwithstanding. Anyway, as I was saying, this is not just a way for me to access the various levels of the base. The elevator car does not fill the entire space, so I filled the rest of the shaft with blocks, knowing that at some point I would carve out channels within that layer of blocks to facilitate storage networks, pipes for fluids, even a maintenance shaft. uh, or a Jeffries tube if you prefer. Yeah, I really do need to build one of those, but I think I'll hide the entrances with secret doors. Partly because any big Victorian era structure just seems to kind of need to have secret doors, but mostly just because. Now, you may have noticed that I'm using cabinets instead of chests, barrels, or even drawers, and that's because I think they generally look better. And at some point, I will get around to crafting textures with higher resolutions, and that will probably improve the appearance of the system overall. But when choosing which types of wood to use, I usually stick with dark oak for builds that are supposed to be more elegant and sophisticated. And I think that's reflected in vanilla Minecraft by the paneled doors and trapdoors. I think they look and feel like the kind of doors you would have in a Victorian era mansion or house, and so that was my original choice. But when I decided that I wanted to separate the edible stuff from the rest, I knew that I would need to use a different wood type, or I would be constantly using the wrong network for the wrong kind of material, and that would goober up my system. So I chose cherry wood. Now, if my modded woods were closer to the real world counterparts, I think I would have chosen mahogany, as it was also a favorite of the era, and it has a deep dark and reddish luster. When I was a kid, I had a genuine mahogany dresser, and I remember spending a lot of time admiring the finish. But I chose cherry instead, and that's probably because it has a very distinct look, and the red and white cabinet design reminds me very much of a first aid station or cabinet. And truthfully, that's pretty much what food in Minecraft's all about, so I thought the choice would be most appropriate. The whole idea for setting up separate but overlapping networks to achieve a larger overall network first came to me when I was working on the mod deep dive video I mentioned earlier. In fact, that's one of the main reasons why I make those videos, because as I go through the process of making the video, I learn the mod in depth, and then I can make the best possible use of it in my own world. And so if you've ever wondered as to how and why I pick the mods I do for that series, it's usually because the mod I made the video for has functionality or is otherwise directly useful for something that I'm currently working on or will soon work on as a part of this series. Of course, as I finish each of these transitory networks, it's necessary to test them. However, one has to be careful because it's not just a matter of testing whether they actually work, and I do indeed do that, but it's also to test that they work to the furthest extent of the destination networks, and that I didn't accidentally join them together, or that I properly connected them to their destination networks in the first place. And some of that testing I can do now, and some of it will have to wait until after I get the other networks in place. But if you're an old video game player, the rule back in the day was to save early and save often. Well, in engineering, there's a similar rule: test early and test often. Now, if you've ever played Fallout, you are probably familiar with the idea of self-sufficiency and independence. That's what the vaults are generally all about, right? You grow, manufacture, or otherwise produce as much as you can by yourself and minimize what you need to trade or rely on others for. Now, this is pretty much how I've played Minecraft since the beginning, which is to say that ever since my very first Minecraft base, there's been a desire and a drive to come up with resource production and storage areas and organization schemes that will allow me to keep pretty much everything I run across so that I can easily, or semi-easily, find and use it again at a later date. Now, in the beginning, that was fairly easy. The number of different blocks and items was a lot smaller than it is now. However, over the years, it's gotten more complicated as even vanilla Minecraft has added more and more materials and items. And of course, running modded Minecraft has just blown that problem all out of proportion. Now, since I have not and still do not use any of the technology mods where stored materials are abstracted off into the ether and then use an interface to find the needed materials in the system and possibly craft stuff directly out of the system, I will need to have a physical solution to the organization of my storage. Long before I played modded Minecraft, I had refined my technique to using walls of barrels with item frames to show what was in a particular barrel, or more often, a row of barrels. Now, in those days, I was limited by how much I could store in a single barrel, so I had many, many more barrels than I do have drawers in this build. And so my storage levels were like walking around 4 or 5 Costco's combined into a single super huge mega Costco. And the problem with that is that once you got in the middle of that mess, everything looked the same and it was incredibly easy to get lost. Even for me, and I was the guy who designed and built it in the first place. My eventual solution was to color code the various sections of storage and then to put items of a given type into each color coded section. Now, this worked like a charm, and it looked good, and at least looked interesting as well. And so I'm continuing that rather practical tradition here. However, since the Storage Drawers mod has given me the ability to upgrade individual drawers to hold an absolutely insane number of stacks, I think that all I'll ever need for any given item is just one drawer. And so I should be able to drastically reduce the physical space I need to store anything and everything I find, so my color coding can be dramatically simplified as well. In this space, I'm using special concrete blocks, and I'm using the 4 basic colors found in pretty much every board game, as well as the Microsoft logo. That's blue, red, green, and yellow. Red is where I'm storing my ores, metals, gems, and basic stone types, as well as all of their derivative blocks and items. I'm also including all of my mainline crafting bits in here, like leather, feathers, flint, bone meal, gunpowder, and that kind of thing. The yellow section is where I'm storing soils, including dirt, sand, gravel, clay, and of course all of their derivative blocks and materials as well. Green is reserved for items from the natural world, including saplings, logs, flowers, and other plant-based items. And finally, blue is where I'm storing all of my furniture and hardware, including doors, fences, machines and machine parts, redstone components, and purely decorative items. Now, as much as possible, I'm trying to group similar items together to make it easier to find specific items and to browse in those situations where I have the flexibility to make a choice between multiple items. For example, I will store all my doors next to each other, and all my block space on cobblestone and stone will be grouped together as well, and so on and so on. From past experience, I found that building long walls filled with containers often means that I have a lot of running around to get to a particular container, and then a lot of running back around the wall to return. So I've devised a system where these walls of containers are broken up with plenty of walkways between them, and that makes it easier to walk directly to the container I want, or need, and then to walk directly away from it. Something else to note here is that despite the fact that these storage blocks are deep underground and are most definitely sheltered from the elements on the surface, I've covered them here with a ceiling and cornices, which are the overhanging bits on the outer edges. Now, these features are designed to be both decorative and useful in real life, keeping the stuff under them protected from the weather. However, in this case, and often in real life as well, they're used in a completely indoor context where weather doesn't really play into it, but I think that they definitely make it look much better. In fact, I think the end result looks more Victorian or Edwardian specifically because I added these features. And you will also note that these walls are probably not textured with anything that you're particularly familiar with. Now, I'm using the chipped mod, and it has a lot of great designs, but they're all 16x. The deep slate block that has a border that kind of resembles stitching is one where I took the original chip design and tried to retexture it to 32x while keeping the original flavor and intent of the original chip design, while also trying to get it to blend in with the deep slate blocks of the Lithos resource pack, which I absolutely love. And except for a slight color adjustment that I need to fix, I think I did a pretty decent job there. You will also notice that the concrete blocks I'm using to color code my storage are in fact imprinted with a heraldic Gryphon device. Now, it's a design I've been using as my avatar for over 20 years, and so I just had to implement it somehow into this place. After all, this is Gryphon Manor, and now you know why. In this particular case, I took the textures for concrete from Lithos and then added the heraldic device and tried to make it look like it was etched into the block. I think it works, but to achieve this level of detail, I had to resort to the same trick that I use on the drawer blocks. And that's to say that the background texture is 32x, but to get the design to look halfway decent, I had to up the resolution for the entire texture to 64x. I also had to take over some blocks from the chipset, as they certainly didn't include any Gryphon-based designs. In this case, they do have a stop block, and they have one defined for every color of concrete. And quite frankly, I really can't picture myself ever using those blocks, so I appropriated them for use as my own Gryphon blocks. So just a quick note, my sincerest apologies to the folks that made the chip mod. I love your mod. I just had to tweak it a little bit to satisfy my ego and brand, so please forgive me. So I am, or was, a bit of a foodie, and over the years my waistline has suffered as a result of that. However, a great deal of interest in food and cooking is still buried in there somewhere, and that's spilled into Minecraft for some reason. But for the record, I absolutely hate, and I mean hate with an unbridled passion, how cooking and food have been implemented into vanilla Minecraft, kind of like an afterthought. It's there, you can't ignore it unless you tone down the difficulty level, yet it's more of an annoyance than anything else, and for something that you need to spend a non-trivial amount of time and energy to set up and maintain, you get very little for the effort. But with that said, I'm willing to put aside a great deal of my belly aching and embrace the world of modded foods and cooking, which makes eating, and sometimes drinking, less of an afterthought and more of a component in a long-term endgame strategy. And it can be fun, too. To bring fun and functionality to a system I otherwise abhor, I'm using Farmer's Delight along with several of its add-ons, as well as Create Central Kitchen. For now, cooking will be manual, as I can easily whip up all the food I need, and quite possibly all the food I would ever need, manually. However, I reserve the right to partially or fully automate any or all of it at some point in the future, and that might involve building assembly lines down at the workshop level, which would require some kind of solution for getting foods from the kitchen into the workshop level and then back again. I've already built 2 networks that can probably handle that, but they currently don't have the smarts or capability to sort food items from the other stuff. And the solution may involve some fancy filtering at some point, but like I said, for now, I'm doing it all by hand. Besides, who wants a commercially processed factory-produced quiche when one could have a homemade gourmet quiche? Well, frankly, who even knows what the hell a quiche is? So, great, I'm making myself hungry. And while we're talking about the food storage network, I want you to think back a few minutes ago when I talked about my design for main storage, where I broke the storage up into blocks for easy access and to make it easier to divide and organize similar items. Now, that's the deal here as well. However, there is no color coding, as I have a lot less need for a huge storage system set up to house and organize hundreds of different items. In this case, we're talking about dozens, so even what I'm setting up here is probably overkill to some point, but I have room to grow in case new food mods come out, or, God willing, if Mojang does a major overhaul of the food system. And then there's the kitchen itself. Now, if you've watched Upstairs, Downstairs, or Downton Abbey, or The Gilded Age, then you might have some idea where I'm headed with this space. In this case, I've set up a large central fireplace, which would have been the primary place for the cooking back in the day, but in more recent times, the primary cooking would have been moved to stoves and ovens, which I've set up to one side of the fireplace. To facilitate food preparation, I've set up some large work tables out in the open room, and I've set up some counters and a cauldron with a working faucet, courtesy of the Supplementaries mod. Now, this gives me an infinite water supply with only a single block, which in this case is a waterlogged stair block. I can use it to fill the cauldron and then fill a bucket from the filled cauldron. Now, it's slightly slower and more convoluted than vanilla Minecraft, but it is a nice touch, and it's a nudge toward the more living, breathing world that I'm trying to put together here. And I think this means I've met my planned goals. I have a network that will carry stuff down to main storage from each level of the underground portion of the manor. And likewise, I have a second network that will carry tasty bits up to the kitchens at the top of the underground levels. And then I have two large storage networks set up for permanent storage, one for main storage at the bottom of the stack and one for the kitchens at the top. And as a metaphorical cherry on top, I have a proper and working kitchen set up where I can put together pretty much any kind of edible tidbits that my mods allow. And I've moved out all the stuff I had crammed in my ad hoc living space, so it's now all properly sorted and put away within the new storage systems as it should be. So where do I go from here? Well, in the next episode, I take the big step of supplying power to the base. And frankly, that episode has only gotten more complex because of all the stuff that has happened to date. And I've not even started it yet, so I will explain all of that next time. But in the meanwhile, I hope this finds you and yours in good health, good spirits, and a touch of good fortune. Take care of yourselves out there. Cheers.